So this is part 2 of the Leeming Lane stretch of Dere Street, and it's about the coming of the stagecoach and the hostelries, pubs if I can't, for want of a better word, along Leeming Lane. The road renaissance started with the stagecoach, and they appeared in the sort of, I don't know, early 1600s. Initially they were just like a farm cart with a cover over the top of it. That was how they started off. But they very quickly improved. They got springing eventually, and much bigger wheels, so that on these heavily rutted roads you weren't thrown about quite as much as you were on a small wheeled farm cart. But these new stagecoaches, yeah, they were an expensive business. You know, it was like first class on aeroplanes today. They were only for the very, very rich, seriously rich, and were moving about between their big estates, which had been handed down from French lords. In fact, some of them still retained their French surnames. Even today there are lots of do this and do that around the place. And in the cities they carried out their sort of lucrative businesses, whatever it was, trying to make their fortunes. Most of it was in shipping and mining, including the dreadful slave trade. The stages also carried parcels and goods, but again, it was an expensive business, and there was no guarantee that your goods were going to get to the other end. And they were called stagecoaches because they moved in stages. Each stage was about 15 miles, at the end of which there was usually some hostelry where the horses were changed and the passengers got their refreshments. And so the clientele was fed and rested. And many of these hostelries, these inns, became famous, and many of them are still around. The main eastern road from London led up to York via places like Stamford, Newark, Doncaster and Tadcaster, and it became known as the Great North Road. And from York there were 3 branches, and all of them were called the Great North Road. They were sort of competing for the title of the Great North Road. The reason there were 3 main stagecoach companies running from York northwards, all competing for custom. One travelled from York to Newcastle via Boroughbridge, Topcliffe and Northallerton, and another went via Thirsk, Northallerton and Croft. Very few of them travelled due north up the old Roman road, Dere Street, because there was nothing there. There was no towns, There were a few scattered villages, but they weren't actually on the main road. They tended to be to the east or the west. The reason being, of course, if you lived alongside one of these main roads, it was a rapid escape route for people up to no good. A bit like today. They came from the main towns and thieving and anything that wasn't screwed down, and robbing people with threats of violence. So, travelling up Dere Street due north were only coaches like the Herald, which went from York up to Scotch Corner via Borough Bridge, and then along to Greta Bridge, and then over the top of Stainmoor to Carlisle, and then on to Glasgow. The stagecoach companies all had names, like the Telegraph or the Courier, the Red Rover. There was one rather strangely called the Economist, probably cheap, and the Tally Ho. The roads had to be maintained by the parish, and there was a chap appointed by the parish to see to this, and he could sequester horses and labour and materials to carry out this work. But some parishes were absolutely useless, and the bloke was born out. The roads were just horrendous. Morasses, he sank up to the axles, and horses sank into this stuff, and progress was terribly slow. And in the winter time there was absolutely no progress at all. He just couldn't move about the place. So something had to be done about it, and Parliament decided to introduce turnpikes, the sort of equivalent of toll roads, or the first toll roads. And turnpike trusts were set up, and the one that took over Dere Street was the Borough Bridge and Pierce Bridge turnpike, and they put gates across at different intervals along that stretch of road. They were called turnpikes because when they were first set up they had a sort of big pike set in the road. I mean, a pike was a lance about, I don't know, between 12 and 16 feet long, with a big spiky end on it, which if somebody decided they were going to clatter their way through with horses, the horse would end up on the end of this spike. And so once you'd paid your toll, the spike was turned out of the way, and you could then carry on, and that's how they got this name, turnpike. But the pike soon disappeared. It was just big gates across, and there was a tollkeeper's cottage built alongside, but by they weren't very popular. A bit like traffic wardens. and there was a lot of trouble, and very occasionally there were sort of riotous crowds and threatened to do away with these toll gates and give the collector of the tolls a good thumping, fill him in. And a sizable number of the leaders of these, there were riots really, were arrested. You know, they were all shipped off to Australia. Keep them out of the way. used to take months to get there, and you were there for, oh goodness knows how many years. And not very many of them came back. So there we were, 1743. Dere Street was a toll road. It was dead straight. And the road surface began to be improved. These turnpike trusts improved the roads quite dramatically. So more and more stagecoaches began to use Dere Street, bypassing York, missed York out. They just came up to Wetherby and then carried straight on because it was so fast. And by 1830 there were 3,000 stagecoaches a year clattering up and down Dere Street. So by this time it used to take 40 hours to travel between London and Edinburgh, pulled by horses. I mean, that was a fair old lick. And a chap called McAdam, he, a sort of road engineer, he produced a surface of finely compacted stones. Which was very, very good. But of course in wet weather they tended to be washed down to the sides of the road. But later on, tar was added to hold the stones in place. This bitumastic stuff. And it was known as tarred macadam, from which we get tarmac. In 1635, that was when the first mail was introduced, where you could take your parcel or letter to an inn, and it would be picked up there and taken by coach to the address you'd put on it. But it was a sort of really dodgy business. I mean, people were pinching stuff hand over fist. And even if you got there, it used to take weeks. And again, it wasn't cheap. But by the late 1700s, Parliament decided that this needed sorting out, and so they introduced the mail coach. This was a sort of Pullman coach, if you like. It was fast. It didn't have to stop at toll gates. So when they arrived, when they were approaching a toll gate, the bloke on the front blew his horn, and if the toll gate wasn't open, by the time the coach got there was all hell to pay, and big fines were levied on gatekeepers. The mail coaches also carried a guard with a couple of pistols and a blunderbuss, so it wasn't likely to be robbed. There were easier pickings elsewhere, and they were very, very punctual. Towns used to set their clocks by the arrival of the coach, the mail coach. And so by this time the Great North Road had been established, and that was what it was called. Great North Road, due north. And this little stretch became known as Leeming Lane. Leeming, of course, being a village on the Great North Road. Leeming Lane became notorious. It was fast. And coaches used to race one another up it, side by side in some places. Coachmen absolutely leathering their horses to go faster to get custom at the next inn, the next hostelry, or the next stage, as it was. must have been a terrifying experience for passengers. These great big wheels of these stagecoaches side by side, sometimes banging into one another. This coachman's hollering at these horses, trying to get an extra half a mile an hour out of them. Now the other big threat were highwaymen. Everybody's heard about Dick Turpin, and they have this image of being very gallant. And nothing of the sort. They were just thugs. A good Indian word. And these next pages are taken from a book published in 1820 about the coaching days. Back to the script. You never knew what you were going to come across when you were riding by a stagecoach, and passengers on the London to Exeter coach had an extraordinary experience. It was travelling in the middle of the night. As it was travelling through the darkness, the coachman noticed a big beast loping along beside the coach. And when he got to the next stage, this beast set about the lead horse, attacked it. So the coachman turned a really vicious bull mastiff onto this beast. Anyway, the beast just tore it apart and killed it. It was an escaped lioness. Passengers running in all directions. The people in charge of this thing managed to get some ropes on it and dragged it off, which was a very brave thing to do. And the horse survived, of course badly scarred, and the story got round, and the owner of the horse, he used to exhibit it at fairs and shows and made a tidy sum of money out of it. The main coaching inn serving Leeming Lane was the New Inn, and there was a smaller establishment just up the road, in fact, called the Oak Tree Inn. But the New Inn was the main one, and it had stabling for 20 horses out the back. In fact, the stabling was still there until it was demolished. And horses for coaches were provided by owners of horses, a bit like somebody having a fleet of cars. Some of these owners had thousands of horses all over the country, which they leased to the coach companies. In fact, coach companies used to lease coaches as well. So there were companies that actually owned coaches, which they then leased to coach companies. Sounds a bit odd, but anyway, that was how it was. But all the way along Leeming, it's only 13 miles. There were lots of other houses which combined sort of farming and innkeeping. And Leeming Lane, in those 13 miles, had 14. of these places, between Leeming Bar and Dishforth. And this next little series of photographs is of these 14 hostleries cum farms, and some very interesting history that went with them. This is a surprising history that went with them. So there's where possible, there's a photograph of the establishment and where it was on the route, a little map. Unfortunately, some of these hostleries, there's no photographs of them, and they've long since gone. So starting at the top end of Leeming Bar, moving south, the first one was the Sportsman's Inn at Leeming Bar, which there is no evidence of at all today. Where it stood is just a piece of grassy verge, for want of a better word, and it was at the junction of Leesy's Lane and Low Lane, opposite what is now a little garage. As you come in south, the A1, or the Great North Road, or Leesy's Lane, crossed the main road from Northallerton going up Wensleydale, what is now Leeming Bar. Obviously a toll bar there from which it gets its name. And on that corner was the Leeming Bar Inn, which is now known as the Corner House Hotel. Very imaginative. And it's one of only 2 of these 14 inns which are still trading. So you come south, you go over Baydale Beck, over the bridge, into Leeming Village itself, and on the left hand side was the Black Ox. It's now a guest house. Today the main road going down through Leeming is called Roman Road. And as you carry on only, I would think maybe less than 100 yards, on the right hand side was the Crown Inn. No evidence of it at all. It's the entrance into a little estate. The road then straightens out, going down through Leeming Village, and on the left hand side is the Willow Tree, which had a very thriving clientele, and of course was boosted because it was very popular with RAF personnel during the Second World War. Not just RAF personnel, there were airmen from all over the place, mainly from Canada, I think. As you continue down Dere Street, not very far away, you come to a place called Londonderry, and on the left hand side is a building which at the moment is painted white, called Londonderry Lodge, and it's a listed building. It's 18th century, and you can tell by it it's got a sort of bay window on the north end, which is obviously very old. I think originally it had been called the Lion and Lamb, but in 1953 it opened as Lawson's Cafe, Lawson being the name of the proprietor. And it was a transport cafe, and it had a dormitory upstairs. He used to sleep 52. Later on it was subdivided into smaller rooms, which were shared. But when the Leeming bypass opened in the 1960-61, trade just died a death. Was upgraded to motorway in 2012. The bottom end of Londonderry village was blocked off, and the road from the A1 directly into Londonderry, again it was blocked off. So Londonderry is basically a cul-de-sac, and it would seem that was its death knell. At the moment, was it 2015, it appears to be closed. And then further down the road in Londonderry, on the left-hand side, opposite the blacksmiths, which still exists, was a pub called the Cleveland Arms, which is now a private house. So we're now clattering down Dere Street. The next one we come to on the left hand side is the Oak Tree Inn. In the early 19th century, a terrace of 7 houses was built by the side of the Great North Road, and on the south end of this, number 7 was somewhat larger than the rest, and it was called on the 1856 map the Oak Tree Inn. But by 1914 it seems to have disappeared. Well, as an inn, it was still there as a house, but it wasn't an inn. And in 2009 the whole of the terrace was flattened, and the Oak Tree Inn went with it. Moseying away down the road, you don't have to go very far. On the left hand side was the main hostelry, the New Inn. It was a very grand Georgian house, it really was, and it was a very popular place. I mean, Leeming Lane was dead straight, and so it was used for horse racing by all and sundry. People came from miles. They came up from the Midlands to bet on horse racing on Leeming Lane outside the New Inn, and there was all sorts of gambling and chicanery. Well, still rolling along in our imaginary stagecoach. You come to the Great North Road, Cinderby Crossroads, and there was a toll gate there called the Butcher House Toll Gate. And alongside it, there was a pub called the Golden Lion Inn, which you can see on the 1856 map, but by 1910 the toll gate and the gold lying in and disappeared, and I can't find any pictures of them anywhere. The next one was the old Crabtree Inn. I mean, I've spoken to various people about these inns, and no one seems to have heard of this place at all, and it was there for a long time. It appeared on the 1856 map, and it was still there on the 1930 map. I have a sneaky suspicion it probably disappeared when the Great North Road was made into a dual carriageway, because the site of it seems to be under what is now the A6055, or the old A1. The northbound carriageway seems to have ploughed it into oblivion. Next came the Fox and Hounds on the left, on the east side of the road going south. That was what it was marked as on the 1856 map. But its name was changed to the Bedale Hunt Inn, and it later became a transport cafe in about, I think, 1953. And it was well thought of. You look at truckers, sort of old truckers reminiscing about their days travelling up and down the A1, and Bedale Hunt Inn is spoken of very, very favourably. Now, it was demolished in 2004, the Bedale Hunt Inn, and again, I can't find a photograph of it anywhere, leaving a sort of large derelict site, upon which appeared a decrepit little touring caravan. It was there for months. Tens of thousands of people, if not hundreds of thousands of people, must have driven past this thing, stuck there ignominiously in the middle of nowhere. I thought it was somebody had abandoned it, or maybe it might have belonged to a workman, or maybe a wheel bearing had gone and it was awaiting repair. Whatever it was, anyway, it was far from what everyone else imagined. A great big sign appeared stuck on the side of it for a sex shop in Darlington. It upset the planners no end, because first of all it was about a sex shop, but secondly they didn't have planning permission for it. So the planners decided to investigate the whole business. And when they were pursuing this, they discovered that it was a brothel. God, you have to laugh. It was an outpost of a brothel attached to this sex shop in Darlington. This brothel was called the Fantasy Ranch. And the women in there gave themselves sort of fancy American names. I imagine like Trixie Belle or whatever. And they offered a variety of sexual services, as it was described in court. Any sexual desire could be catered for. The owner of the establishment who lived in a real big house up in North Stainmore. He'd been a salesman of double glazing at one time, but obviously brothel keeping was far more lucrative. He got a year's jail, and they froze all his assets, of nearly £1 million. This has dragged on and dragged on and dragged on, because it would seem that he wasn't paying his dues to the taxman, or to the court for that matter. In 2011 he published a book in America called The Brothel Keeper, and in it he makes claims that it wasn't as everybody thought. Anyway, it's very explicit, and certainly not for the narrow-minded. So we're coming to the end of the innkeeping bit. Only two to go. Further down the road on the right hand side was a huge house called, on the 1856 maps, the York Gate Inn, and more about that later. This is just a little map of where it was, and indeed where it still is. And then finally, on the 1856 maps, is the Windmill Inn, which was on the left-hand side, just south of the Great North Road, Baldersby Road junction. And again, there's just a little map of where it was. It would seem that it was closed and divided into two cottages, which became known as the Windmill Cottages. And again, a little bit more about that later on.